In 1965, 3 coal miners in eastern Kentucky broke through a barrier they were strictly ordered not to disturb. Beyond it, they found a chamber that should not have existed. Inside lay skeletal remains measuring more than 9 feet in height, positioned in rows like soldiers on parade. Within 72 hours, the mine was sealed with concrete. The miners were paid for their silence, and the story was entombed with whatever had been uncovered. But here is what those same mining companies do not want you to know. Kentucky rests atop one of the most vast cave systems in North America. According to dozens of classified mining reports, forgotten newspaper clippings, and deathbed confessions from miners, those caves were not always empty. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is about physical evidence that was interred, records systematically destroyed, and an entire generation of coal miners who witnessed things below ground that prompted their companies to seal entire sections and abandon millions of dollars in unmined coal. Evidence that hints our understanding of who inhabited this continent, and when may be fundamentally flawed. Welcome to the story they tried to erase. Eastern Kentucky in the early 20th century was consumed by a coal rush. Companies tore into the Appalachian Mountains with dynamite and steam shovels, racing to extract every possible ton before the seams ran dry. These were industrial enterprises run by men who measured success in tons per day, not historical preservation. The land was ripped open, the mountains hollowed, and anything in the path was treated as an obstruction, not a discovery. The miners were not scientists. They were laborers. Most had never completed elementary school. They worked 12-hour shifts in darkness, breathing coal dust, knowing each swing of the pickaxe could trigger a collapse. Their job was to dig load and survive. They were not seeking history. They were seeking coal. But beginning around 1901, miners in Breathitt County started reporting something odd. They were uncovering bones. Not animal bones, not typical human bones, but bones that were too long, too thick, and too carefully arranged to be accidental burials. Bones belonging to beings that should not exist according to everything. They had been taught about history. The first documented case comes from mining foreman Silas Hatcher. In his personal journal, recovered in 1998 from an estate sale, Hatcher describes his crew breaking into a burial vault near Jackson, Kentucky. Inside were 7 skeletons, each measuring between 8 and 10 feet in length. The skulls featured double rows of teeth. The femurs were thicker than their sledgehammer handles. Hatcher reported the discovery to his supervisor. The mine owner brought in a doctor from Lexington to examine the remains. The doctor took measurements, collected samples, and wrote a report that was never made public. 2 weeks later, the entire section was backfilled with rubble. Hatcher's journal entry concludes with this line: "They paid us double wages for the month and told us the vault was empty when we opened it. We all knew better, but we all took the money." That pattern would persist for 60 years. Miners would break into chambers, uncover skeletal remains of unusual size, report it, the mine would be sealed, and the story would be buried. In 1934, the Courier-Journal in Louisville published a brief article on page 9. The headline, "Giant Skeleton Found in Cave Near Prestonsburg." 2 hunters exploring a cave found a skeleton measuring 9 feet 4 inches, lying in a stone coffin carved from limestone. The coffin bore symbols neither man could identify. The article mentioned that a Smithsonian representative was traveling to Kentucky to examine the discovery. A follow-up was promised within the week. That follow-up never appeared. The Smithsonian has no record of the trip. When researchers attempted to locate the cave in the 1970s, the landowner claimed it had collapsed. Between 1920 and 1950, at least 12 coal mines in eastern Kentucky were permanently sealed despite containing profitable coal seams. Official explanations varied. Structural instability, gas pockets, flooding. But the economics did not add up. These companies walked away from millions in mapped, ready to extract coal. Miners told a different story. Chambers filled with artifacts made from metals that did not corrode, stone tablets covered in unrecognizable script, skeletal remains clearly human in form, but not human in size. One miner, speaking anonymously in 1989, described finding a bronze shield beneath Pike County, over 4 feet wide, showing no rust despite burial in damp earth. Carved into its surface was a scene depicting tall figures constructing massive stone buildings. His foreman confiscated it and warned that mentioning it would end his career in Kentucky coal. The next week, that entire section was dynamited and sealed with concrete. The question is not whether these discoveries happened. The documentation is too consistent. The witnesses too numerous, the economic decisions too illogical. The question is, who were these giants? And why does someone want their existence erased? This is where the Tartaria connection enters. For those unfamiliar, the Tartaria hypothesis proposes that a technologically advanced civilization existed across the northern hemisphere until relatively recently. This civilization built massive stone structures, created extensive underground networks, and then vanished through cataclysmic events and deliberate historical revision. Kentucky's cave systems, according to this theory, were not natural formations early settlers discovered. They were pre-existing infrastructure built by this earlier civilization. The giants were not anomalies. They were the builders. Mammoth Cave contains over 400 miles of map passages. Mainstream science claims water carved these over millions of years, but many passages are too uniform, too precisely angled, too deliberately connected to be random erosion. Explorers in the 1800s reported finding worked stone structures deep inside, perfectly cut blocks fitted without mortar, chambers with domed ceilings, tunnels descending at exact angles for miles. These reports were dismissed as exaggeration, but the descriptions match similar findings in cave systems worldwide. From Turkey's Derinkuyu underground city to Malta's Hypogeum, we have evidence ancient civilizations built extensive subterranean complexes. Kentucky's limestone is ideal for similar construction, easy to carve when fresh, hardening with air exposure into structures lasting millennia. What if Kentucky's caves were not shelters built by primitive natives, but remnants of a much older, larger civilization? What if the giants were the people who built them? The Smithsonian Institution has played a peculiar role. Between 1880 and 1920, they funded dozens of archaeological expeditions across the United States, particularly in the Ohio River Valley and Appalachian regions, excavating thousands of burial mounds and cave sites. Official records show standard findings: native pottery, tools, human remains of typical size. But newspaper accounts from that era tell another story. They describe the Smithsonian removing massive skeletons from mounds in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. They quote Smithsonian officials confirming these findings. Then the stories stop. In 1894, the New York Times ran an article, "Bones of Prehistoric Giant Found." A Smithsonian expedition in West Virginia uncovered a skeleton 7 feet 6 inches tall with an unusually large skull. The remains were being transported to Washington for study. No study was ever published. The remains are not in any Smithsonian collection. When modern researchers request information, they are told no records exist. A researcher named Jim Vera compiled over 500 newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s describing giant skeleton discoveries across North America. Reputable papers, quotes from doctors, scientists, local officials, discoveries that were documented, measured, photographed. Almost none of this physical evidence exists in any museum or university collection today. Either every newspaper fabricated elaborate hoaxes for no reason, or someone systematically removed evidence of giant humans from the archaeological record. The coal seams in eastern Kentucky formed 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period, but the chambers where miners found skeletal remains were not in the coal. They were carved into the limestone bedrock beneath and around the coal seams. This matters. If the chambers were natural caves humans later used for burial, you would expect them to follow natural fault lines and water channels. But miners consistently reported chambers that were clearly artificial. Walls too smooth and vertical, ceilings arched in ways that do not occur naturally, floors leveled, and sometimes paved with fitted stone. Mine inspector Robert Cantrell discovered an intact chamber in 1956 while investigating a collapse in Harlan County. He described it as 30 feet square with a domed ceiling reaching 15 feet at the center. The walls were lined with cut stone blocks. In the center was a stone platform with 3 skeletons arranged side by side. Cantrell was a trained engineer. In his official report, he stated clearly the chamber was not natural. Someone had carved it deliberately, fitted it with stone blocks showing tool marks, and used it for burial. His report included measurements. The shortest skeleton, 8 feet 2 inches. The tallest, 9 feet 7 inches. All 3 showed massive bone density and musculature beyond modern humans. Cantrell submitted his report to the state mining authority. He was told to revise it and remove all references to the chamber and remains. When he refused, he was reassigned to a desk job. The mine was sealed within a month. Years later, Cantrell said, "I saw what I saw. I measured what I measured. I'll tell anyone who asks that we sealed up a room full of giants because someone did not want the world to know they existed." But who is suppressing this? And why? What could possibly be worth destroying evidence and walking away from profitable mines? One theory points to organized religion. If humans are not the first intelligent species on Earth, if advanced civilizations rose and fell before recorded history, that undermines creation narratives of major religions, questions about human uniqueness and divine purpose that many institutions would rather not address. If giants existed, if they built cities and worked with advanced metallurgy thousands of years before the timeline we have been taught, then the story of human origins needs to be completely rewritten. Another theory focuses on academic gatekeeping. Archaeology is built on specific models of human development. Evidence of advanced cultures existing thousands of years earlier than currently accepted invalidates careers, textbooks, entire branches of study. Admitting error at that scale destroys institutional credibility. Universities would have to acknowledge that generations of professors taught incorrect information. Museums would have to rewrite their exhibits. The entire academic establishment would have to admit they have been fundamentally wrong about human history. But there is a third theory that is harder to dismiss. What if suppression is not about protecting beliefs or academic reputations? What if it is about resources? About controlling access to knowledge and technology that could reshape entire industries? Kentucky's coal made certain families and corporations wealthy beyond measure. They owned the mines, the land, the railroads, the local governments. They controlled what information left their territory. They decided what stories were told and what stories were buried. If word spread that valuable artifacts, advanced metals, or unknown technologies were being found in Kentucky caves, it would attract unwanted attention. Federal authorities would seize the sites. Academic institutions would demand access. Other corporations would try to stake claims. Control would shift away from the mining companies. By sealing the mines and burying evidence, companies maintained exclusive access. If there is anything down there worth more than coal, They know where it is. They know what is there. And they have made sure no one else can get to it. Not researchers, not archaeologists, not government officials, nobody. Specific cases show the pattern clearly. In 1927, a mining crew in Martin County broke into a chamber containing 11 skeletons, arranged in a circle, each over 8 feet tall. In the center was a stone altar with a bronze bowl containing ashes and bone fragments from a much smaller human. Mine foreman Tobias Fletcher documented the find in his daily log. He sketched the chamber layout and described the bronze bowl, noting it showed no corrosion despite mine dampness. Fletcher wrote the ashes were being sent to a Cincinnati laboratory for analysis. The lab results never came back. Fletcher's log was confiscated. The chamber was filled with concrete thick enough that ground-penetrating radar cannot see through it. Fletcher's grandson still has photocopies of some log pages. They are considered some of the strongest documentary evidence these finds occurred. Another case, the Sandy Hook mine disaster of 1946. 15 miners killed when a section collapsed during excavation. Official reports blamed faulty timber supports. Survivors told a different story. The crew had broken into a large cavern showing signs of artificial construction. Inside were stone structures carved from cave walls. Scattered throughout were skeletal remains of enormous size. The foreman ordered everyone out while he radioed for instructions. While waiting, the cavern ceiling began to crack. Survivors claimed it sounded like explosives going off in sequence, bringing down specific support columns. They believed the company triggered the collapse deliberately. Official investigation found no explosives. The mine closed permanently. Families of the dead received unusually generous settlements, provided they signed agreements never to discuss circumstances. These are not isolated incidents. They follow a pattern spanning 7 decades and dozens of mines. Find something unusual. Report it. Get silenced. Seal the mine. Almost all these mines are now on private property owned by corporations with legal teams larger than small town police departments. Exploring sealed sections without permission is trespassing, breaking and entering, potentially violating federal mining safety regulations. The evidence is locked behind concrete, steel, and lawyers. But some miners kept digging in their own way. They kept journals. They took photographs when possible. Before they died, some talked. Miner Clayton Morris worked in Hazard from 1955 to 1970. Before his 2003 death, Morris recorded interviews describing an entire underground city carved into limestone beneath Perry County. Multiple levels connected by stone staircases. Chambers with vaulted ceilings reaching 40 feet. Walls covered in carved symbols that looked like writing, but were not any recognizable language. In one chamber, Morris said they found 6 stone coffins, each holding a skeleton measuring between 9 and 10 feet. The coffins were carved from single granite blocks. Strange because there is no natural granite in that area. Someone transported those coffins from elsewhere. Morris described finding metal objects that did not rust or tarnish. One looked like a mirror, but was made from metal lighter than aluminum and harder than steel. When he looked into it, the reflection was so clear it seemed 3-dimensional. His foreman confiscated that mirror. 2 days later, the entire section was sealed with explosives. Morris was adamant. "I've been in caves all over Kentucky. I know what water does to limestone. This was not water. This was construction. Someone built an entire city down there, and we blew it up because it scared the company men." Independent researcher Sarah Holland spent 15 years tracking down former Kentucky miners and recording their stories. Holland's archive contains over 200 hours of testimony from men who worked those mines. Almost all described similar finds. Artificial chambers, giant skeletons, artifacts made from unknown metals, and immediate suppression by mining companies. Holland submitted findings to multiple academic journals. All rejected her work without review. She tried mainstream media. They dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist. When she attempted to organize legal efforts forcing companies to allow archaeological surveys of sealed sections, her lawyer received serious enough threats that he withdrew. Holland's archive still exists on a hard drive in her Lexington home. It represents the most comprehensive collection of first-hand testimony about Kentucky's buried giants. Almost no one knows it exists because no institution will acknowledge its legitimacy. The obvious question: where did these giants come from? Mainstream answer: they did not exist. Claims are hoaxes, misidentifications, or exaggerations by people who did not understand what they saw. But that does not hold up. The sheer number of reports across multiple states, spanning decades documented by newspapers, mining companies, and government officials suggests more than mass hallucination or coordinated fraud. One possibility: genetic outliers. Gigantism is real, caused by excessive growth hormone. People with gigantism can reach 7, 8, even 9 feet in rare cases. Maybe miners found burial sites for individuals with this condition. But that theory falls apart under scrutiny. These were not isolated individuals. Miners consistently reported multiple skeletons in the same chamber, all similar size. That suggests a population of giants, not random medical anomalies. It does not explain the artifacts. Bronze shields, stone coffins carved from granite, metal mirrors that do not corrode. Chambers carved into bedrock with precision. None of that fits what we know about Native American cultures in Kentucky. Pre-Columbian tribes here were Shawnee Cherokee, various Mississippian culture groups. They built earthwork mounds, lived in wooden structures, worked with stone, copper, and bone. There is no evidence they possessed metallurgy to create bronze objects or engineering knowledge to carve multi-level underground cities. So if not Native Americans, who? The Tartarian hypothesis provides a framework mainstream archaeology refuses to consider. According to this theory, an advanced civilization existed across the northern hemisphere until a cataclysmic event destroyed it, possibly 12,000 years ago. This civilization had knowledge of architecture, metallurgy, engineering that was later lost. What we call ancient history, the rise of Sumeria, Egypt, other early civilizations, was actually a recovery period where survivors tried rebuilding using fragmented knowledge. In this framework, Kentucky's giants were not primitive natives. They were remnants of the earlier civilization. Their size, artifacts, underground constructions all fit with the larger pattern of anomalous archaeology that establishment science dismisses. Similar discoveries worldwide. Nevada's Lovelock Cave, where miners found red-haired giants buried with sandals over 15 inches long. Ohio's burial mounds, when 19th-century excavations uncovered skeletons over 8 feet tall with unusual skull features. Nevada's Humboldt Lake, where guano miners found mummies of unusual size, wrapped in fabric carbon, dated over 10,000 years old. The pattern is global. The suppression is consistent. But here is what is different about Kentucky. In most cases, evidence was removed, studied briefly, then disappeared into institutional storage. In Kentucky, evidence was not removed, it was buried again. Mines were sealed with the giant still inside. The evidence still exists. Not in some locked Smithsonian warehouse. Still underground in Kentucky, waiting behind concrete barriers. Is anyone trying to get back in? Yes, but not openly. Over the past 2 decades, multiple reports of unauthorized excavations in eastern Kentucky. Not amateur treasure hunters, professional operations with drilling equipment, ground-penetrating radar, security teams that run off anyone who gets close. Local residents near sealed mines report seeing trucks and equipment arriving at night. Drilling sounds that last for weeks then stop suddenly. artifacts being loaded into vehicles and driven away before dawn. When authorities are called, the response is always the same. The mining company is conducting geological surveys on private property. Everything is permitted and legal. Move along. But these mining companies are not extracting coal anymore. The profitable seams were exhausted decades ago. So what are they surveying? Why at night with security teams? One possibility, they are retrieving what they buried. 50 years ago, sealing mines was about controlling information and maintaining monopoly power. Now, with advances in material science and technology, those artifacts might be worth more than coal ever was. Imagine if the metal objects were analyzed and found to be alloys we cannot reproduce. Imagine if stone structures showed construction techniques we do not understand. Imagine if writings on those walls contained knowledge we have lost. That would not just be archaeologically significant. That would be economically transformative. Companies controlling access to those sites would control access to that knowledge. What can be done? Honestly, it is almost impossible under current conditions. But there are paths forward. Documentation matters. The more people who know about these cases, the harder they are to suppress. Sarah Holland's archive, Jim Vieira's newspaper collection, testimonies of miners like Clayton Morris all contribute to evidence that becomes harder to dismiss as pieces accumulate. Legal pressure can work if applied consistently. Freedom of Information Act requests, historical preservation laws, public interest litigation all provide tools to force transparency. They are slow, expensive, often blocked, but they create paper trails future researchers can follow. Technology is changing the game. Ground-penetrating radar satellite imaging, remote sensing tools can map what is underground without physical access. If enough data is collected showing artificial structures beneath sealed mines, it becomes harder for companies to claim there is nothing worth investigating. But ultimately, the barrier is not technological or legal. It is cultural. As long as mainstream institutions refuse to acknowledge these finds deserve serious investigation, the evidence will remain buried. That is changing slowly. Alternative researchers are building audiences through platforms traditional gatekeepers cannot control. Independent documentaries, podcasts, online archives create spaces where these discussions can happen without institutional approval. The story of Kentucky's buried giants is reaching people who never would have heard it through conventional channels. Some are asking the right questions. Why were profitable coal mines sealed for reasons that do not make economic sense? Why did newspapers stop reporting giant skeleton discoveries after 1920? Why does the Smithsonian have no records of expeditions newspapers documented? Why are mining companies conducting operations at sealed sites they claim are permanently closed? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. One of the 1965 miners, Jesse Combs, broke his silence in 1998 during an interview with a local historian. Combs was in his 70s dying of black lung disease. He had nothing to lose. Combs described the chamber in detail. 12 skeletons arranged in 2 rows of 6 facing east. Each skeleton had a weapon next to it, either a sword or spear made from metal that looked like bronze, but was much harder. Chamber walls were covered in carvings that looked like writing, but were not English or any recognizable language. His crew stood there, maybe 10 minutes before their foreman radioed the surface. Within an hour, supervisors arrived with cameras. They documented everything, took measurements, collected samples, then told the crew to get out. Combs and the other miners were brought to an office and given papers to sign. The papers said they had found nothing. If they claimed otherwise, they would be fired and blacklisted from mining work across the state. They were paid 2 months' wages and sent home. Combs said, I took the money because I had a family to feed. But I never forgot what I saw down there. Those were not normal men. They were giants, and they were buried with honor like warriors. Combs died 6 months after giving that interview. The historian who recorded it tried to publish it in several journals. All rejected it. The recording sat in an archive until 2015, when a researcher found it and uploaded it online. Now, anyone can listen to Jesse Combs describe what he saw. They can hear the conviction in his voice, the detail in his memory, the regret that he stayed silent for 33 years. The recording has been viewed over 500,000 times. The coal mines of eastern Kentucky hold secrets that powerful interests have worked for over a century to keep buried. But the story refuses to die. It persists in journals, in recordings, in newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and in the memories of people who saw things that were not supposed to exist. Kentucky's buried giants are not just about skeletons of unusual size. They are about a pattern of suppression that suggests our understanding of human history is incomplete at best and deliberately falsified at worst. They are about evidence that challenges everything we have been taught about who was here first, how long they were here, and what they were capable of building. The sealed mines are not just about protecting company profits. They are about controlling access to evidence that could rewrite timelines, challenge established narratives, and force institutions to admit they have been wrong for generations. They are about maintaining power, built on incomplete information and selective memory. And the questions are not going away. They are multiplying as more people learn about the finds, connect the patterns, and demand answers that no one in authority seems willing to provide. Every day more recordings surface, more journals are discovered, more researchers piece together fragments of a story that was supposed to stay buried. The giants are still down there behind concrete and steel waiting in the dark. The evidence has not been destroyed. It has been preserved in the most secure archive imaginable, buried in the earth itself, protected by private property laws and corporate legal teams. And someday, whether through legal action, technological advancement, or simple institutional collapse, those seals will break. The chambers will be opened, the artifacts will be brought into daylight, and the world will have to confront what Kentucky miners have known for over a century. There were giants in the earth in those days, giants who built underground cities, giants who worked with metals we cannot identify, giants who were buried with honor like warriors, and someone sealed the mines to make sure we would never prove it. Someone decided controlling this knowledge was more valuable than all the coal in Kentucky. But truth has a way of surfacing. Stories have a way of surviving. And evidence, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way back to light.